Stan in Pennsylvania. Hey, Stan, you are on the air with Truth Wanted. What's going on?
Hi. Nice to talk to you again, Dan. Haven't called in for a while, but I'm glad to be back on the show.
Yes, glad to be back, and thanks for calling in again. I see that you wanted to ask the atheist pastor here a question.
Hey, Stan, how are
you? Before I do that, though, I wanted to say that I'm an American who has met many Australians, actually. I've traveled the world. I've never gone to Australia, but I've met lots and lots of Australians traveling. They're everywhere. And I got to say that, like, almost without fail, my experience with Australians have been excellent. You know, they've been so friendly, and it's always a good time hanging out with them.
Okay, but
so if you want to find an Australian, find your nearest hostel.
Listen, Stan, you know Australia is not real, though, right? Like, you know it's just... Yeah.
Of course. I mean, they're coming from a dream, a fairyland. You know, of course, denizens of an imaginary Neverland are very friendly.
Whose bright idea would it to be to make an island full of criminals? I mean, that's just insane. That's not real. That's fake. That's a fake thing. Anyway, so Stan, thanks for the kind remarks for Chris here. Thanks for calling back to the show. I did see that you wanted to ask us a question here, so go ahead and ask away.
Yeah, sure. So when our pastor here started talking, he mentioned all of the tricks that were used by pastors. I'm not sure we can call them tricks, but just the techniques and methods used by Christianity in general to bring in believers. And so I was wondering, should atheists use similar techniques to bring people back on their side? Is it ethical that we do something like that, especially if we know what we're doing, like if we're doing it specifically for that reason? And would it even be effective?
What a great question.
Really good lot of questions. Would it be ethical? I don't know. Would I do it? I guess for me personally, no, I wouldn't want to use those advanced marketing techniques or the way I speak to try and trick people. And I don't think you should need to. I think if we're looking at what is true and what isn't true, that should be a personal journey that people take. Now, there's nothing that I can say to a lot of people that's going to convince them that either A, there is a God, or B, there isn't a God, because I don't think that's something you can be 100% certain of. I think where people start to use, the marketing techniques to bring people in, it's probably more for self-gain rather than actually getting a message out there or sharing their experiences in a genuine way.
I have a very different answer to this. And, my response would be, we are constantly using techniques on each other when we're talking about these subjects all the time, whether we're consciously recognizing it or not. And I'll give you an example of this, okay? The difference between when I'm talking to somebody about, discussions of God and atheism, and let's say like when Matt Dillahunty is on AXP or when Eric is on Talk Heathen, we're all talking about these things, and a lot of the times we might be convincing people of our ideas. I try to be more neutral, but I do have opinions on things at the end of the day, and I might try to convince you on an idea one way or the other. I'm going to be using techniques based on what I think is effective for people. For example, if I'm talking to an atheist about something and I want to say that, I think that this is true, I might use a publishing from a scientific journal to back up my point. Whereas, if I'm talking to somebody who's more religious in nature, I might talk about a personal experience that affected me. And that might be more convincing to them than what's published in a scientific journal. Whereas it might be the other way around for an atheist, right? So, I think we're always kind of using techniques. I think we can't avoid the idea that we're using techniques. Some techniques are more... we can pin down more than others. The ones that we were talking about earlier was this idea of doing different inflections in our voices and kind of spacing out our messages to hit emotional high and low points for people when talking about our stories. And so that might be something where we can look at, we can say, hey, he's using these rhetorical techniques here, but if we look at the basis of his arguments, they may not hold water. Whether or not we want to be rhetorical in the way that we present ourselves, I think is going to depend on the context. If I'm deliberately trying to convince somebody of an idea that I know is not true, then I would say yes. Obviously, using techniques that we typically use for true ideas, we don't want to do. But if I genuinely think what I'm saying is true, I might use the best techniques possible to convince somebody because this idea is true and that's what I honestly believe. And that's what would be most ethical for myself. So if we're talking about people who genuinely believe in what they're saying, then why wouldn't they want to use the best things that we have available to convince others of what they're true, you know? So yeah, that's my answer there. Maybe a bit more complicated, right?
Yeah. I've now listening to both of you, I'm actually not sure where I fall on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard. It's always that same issue of like using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that good? Is it proper? But in the end, if we accomplish our goal, and I mean, I honestly do think like the atheist standpoint is correct, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And if we accomplish our goals of bringing more people to our side, and then using that newfound popularity to enact secular changes that would benefit all of the theists and atheists, then I mean, I guess would the ends justify the means there? You know, I'm still not sure where I fall in this.
Yeah.
I think you've got to be a little bit careful with some of it, especially when it comes to using techniques like neuro-linguistic programming. What can tend to happen is people will start to follow that individual, and you don't want people to leave religion to essentially fall into a position where they're following, I guess, the atheist leaders or atheist influences in the same way that they followed, I guess, a religious figure or even. Yeah, it's good to listen, I guess, and it's good to have people that you look up to. And I know there's certainly a lot of people within the atheist community that I look up to. But it's a very, very easy trap to fall into.
Sure.
To start looking at those people in that same context, and I think and you're right when you say that, Dan, that when we talk, we do use these techniques without realizing it. You know, subconsciously, you know, we always will. And I think anyone who has an opinion will always want to try and convince others of the opinion. I think for me, it's when you're intentionally using marketing techniques to I guess, almost trick people. I have an issue with that. That being said, a lot of people who do it within the church don't actually realize that they're doing it. I think a lot of the Christian leaders who have learned this in the guise of this is how you speak publicly, that's not necessarily them going out with an intent to, or some it will be, that's not them going out with an intent to fool or deceive people.
Absolutely. And like, you know, a lot of people use these techniques for coercion. You know, they're using it to get money out of people or to get sexual favors out of people or to get, you know, have a sense of power over people. And that's something where we can look at it. We can look at the intentions and say, well, what is the aims here? You know, I will use messages to try to convince people to vote for issues that I think are important. You know, and that's something that I'm going to continue to do because I genuinely believe that that's important for me. That's something that I want to happen. I'm not going to necessarily use these kinds of techniques to, like, you know, get power over people in that kind of way. And that's where we can kind of look at the individual. I don't mind somebody who's on an opposite political spectrum using the same kinds of techniques that I would, if in his heart he really believes what he's saying is true. But if he knows what he's saying isn't true, or if he knows the techniques he's using are going to have an effect on something that wouldn't be, you know, available to look at by other means, then there might be some problems there. But as I said, like, you know, organizations use it for their own purposes. People want other people to do other things. YouTubers want other people to subscribe to their channels. I mean, like, they're going to use those kinds of techniques and stuff too to get their aims. But, like, you know, it definitely, the ends are going to be kind of different there, right?
So as a counterpoint to what the pastor was saying, I mean, some people are convinced by different things, right? Like I would agree with what you were saying in that, like, you don't want people to be to follow people like due to like a cult of personality, right?
Mhm.
Like it's better, and we'll have a more stable movement if people follow us, or at least leave theism on the strength of our arguments, right? I would agree, and that would be my preferred method. However, not everyone is convinced by logical arguments.
Exactly.
I mean, like,
Very
yeah.
true.
Look at people's voting patterns, right?
Yep.
And the reasons people choose one candidate over another are mystifying, right? And it only makes sense to them, right? And oftentimes people are only convinced through emotional appeals, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, right?
Absolutely.
Like, yeah. So
Yeah.
like something that like inspires people often, is like a church choir, right? Like a powerful church song can bring people in a way that like a reasoned argument cannot. So I mean, like we can come up with a song. I mean, it can be about like Darwinism, but like we can come up with a catchy song too, right?
Absolutely,
like, why shouldn't
Stan.
we use those? Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is my point, right? I think we make the mistake when we say, well, I'm going to avoid all of this rhetorical stuff, and I'm just going to use pure logic to convince you of this thing, because we don't realize that that's a rhetorical technique in itself. Because again, if I'm going to be using, like a scientific reference or some other kinds of findings to try to convince you of something, that I'm targeting an audience there, because I know that that's going to convince you rather than someone who might be convinced more by emotional appeals. So like we can't avoid rhetoric is kind of my take on this, right? We just have to pick and choose what's going to be best for us, and try to make those decisions on whether or not what we're doing is ethical, based on our audience, based on what we're trying to convince people of, and being sure in ourselves that what we think is what we're talking about is true, so that's my take on it. But it's a great topic of conversation, Stan. I'm really glad you brought it up. And I do appreciate the call. So I hope to hear from you again, Stan. It's been a bit, but I'd love to talk to you some more sometime.
Yeah, it was fantastic talking to you both. Thanks for taking my call. Have a great day.
You too, Stan.
Good to talk to you, Stan.
Too. Yeah, we could talk about this all day. Like this is really my background. I have a background in communication studies, right? I think I've mentioned it on the show before. This is like I love this kind of stuff in particular. But I'm sure with your background in marketing, you've seen, even outside of what you've seen in the church, you've seen some of these other kinds of techniques that people. I bet you've seen techniques people in the church have used they didn't even realize that they're using, right?
Because absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, I mean, anytime you turn the TV on and you see an ad, they're trying to convince you of something, and they're using marketing techniques to do that, whether it's, to have a can of soft drink, or to watch the new show that's on, or to vote for a particular, candidate or issue. It's people are always trying to convince. And look, I think when it comes down to, I guess we can only know what's ethical for ourselves. And I guess, would I use personally the techniques that I saw or we were being taught at Bible college? No, I wouldn't, because I wasn't comfortable using them as a Christian. I believe that the truth shouldn't need marketing techniques or tricks, because I think if you trick someone into the truth, then really have they found the truth? No, they haven't.
Yeah. Wow. For sure. Yeah, I feel the same way as far as like what I've seen other people use and like how I've seen people talk to people. It's like I wouldn't say that to other people, because again, like those kinds of techniques don't convince me anymore, surely. And I wouldn't want to do the same. But like there's also the question of, well, if these kinds of appeals are good for the audience that we might necessarily want to talk to, maybe it's time we invest in some of those techniques ourselves to be more convincing to them. I think that's the other counterpoint here to look at. But I don't know. We have some other callers for sure. I don't want to get to.